this is William Meyers, who originated, or his former better half originated, the idea of this book, a graphic novel on the life of the Dalai Lama. Actually, it's based on research into the life of the Dalai Lama from many of his own. He has 2 autobiographies, and then there are many other writings about him. And, okay, well, oh, this one is not on? This one is on? Oh, yeah, okay. So then I can turn this one off. And so it's based on that kind of research, but the novel aspect comes from 2 things. One, so it should follow, it should be like a biography of him, but there are several reasons why we don't call it just a biography, but a graphic novel. And those reasons are that there are several of them. And one of them is that he himself would never praise himself in a certain way, the way we do. In other words, he wouldn't want to take the title Man of Peace for himself. He tries to do it, of course, but he wouldn't praise himself, and he wouldn't show his role as a world leader of leaders, for example, which we portray him as. And with this, we finished this. Well, we did the final thing, yes, just before the election, before we realized that among the insane world leaders, we wouldn't be including one of our own. And so we didn't know that. But, you know, he's someone who knows most of the world leaders, except those, the present generation of those in China have never met him. But he's more or less met almost everybody else who is like Angela Merkel, everybody. He met them. If you track back his biographies and the list of the people and dignitaries he's met, he met like the president of Chile when he was Secretary of Minister of Education, you know, like 10 years earlier. So he's like met everyone, really. They've never invited him to Davos because they have Mathieu Ricard. They feel they don't need the Dalai Lama, and they have a happiest guy, you know. Although I think maybe Dalai Lama might be even happier, I'm not sure. But he doesn't, again, he wouldn't claim that, you see. So that's one of the reasons, whereas we want to really show how he does. Then second, in those meetings that he has with this person or that, some bon mots are available in his biographies, like Mao said this, or I said that, religion is poison, you know. So we know those things. But there's a lot of other conversations that nobody has the exact transcripts of. They're not available. And also some of the conversations of the bad guys, like Nixon and Kissinger conspiring to keep Bangladesh and West Pakistan supporting, you know, et cetera. All the international politics that have swirled around the Dalai Lama during his 66-year standing rock resistance against industrial militarism and consumerism. I put it that way rather than just say China. In other words, the evil empire is the empire of a certain lifestyle we can now see rather than just blaming China. It's, you know, typical human greed, colonialism, wish to conquer others, but mobilized by industrialization. So for the first time in history, Tibet was really long-term occupied, has been long-term occupied. Tibet's resources have, for the first time in history, been stripped as much as they can. As you know, trees are mostly gone, the headwaters of many rivers that flow into China. And so the novel aspect has to do with dramatizing things that we have to just assume from the result and so on that were a certain way. And that's the second thing. And I forget what the third reason is why we call it a graphic novel. Oh yeah, because we come out with an ending, since we can't go with His Holiness to what he calls the final reunion, where he greets his people all over Tibet, in all the different regions of Tibet, which we are confident, nobody else is, but we are confident will happen in his lifetime. He is confident it will happen in his lifetime, although he's stretched out. He's stated now that he might live to 113, if necessary. He would rather not, but he's agreed to that, or he's made a pledge to that effect, actually, fulfilling a prophecy of an 18th century Nyingma Lama, who predicted this about the 14th Dalai Lama. So for this reason, we call it a graphic novel. And we've already had responses from people who read it who say that, you know, reading this in the form of a regular book with no pictures, they sort of would lose interest in, you know, here and there, whereas here with the action and the pictures and the drama of this one man versus an empire, with a kind of like ending that ends hanging fire in suspense. You know, that's how it is. You know, he hasn't conquered yet, but we're confident that he will. And actually, recently, someone predicted to me that I've been operating under a curse myself of the senior teacher of the Dalai Lama, who one time I took a little bit of a retreat, very short. I'm not really a big yogi, but I took a short retreat, following a text he wrote, a retreat text, the Dalai Lama's senior teacher, who was a teacher of mine. And I thanked him for that. I visited him and said I had a nice time, and thank you very much for writing the book. He says, I didn't write it. I said, what do you mean? Your name is right here, Ling Sanamache. I said, that was my previous life. In that life, I had time for such things. He said, in this lifetime, all I do is work for the government. Because he had to be 12 years, I think, 9 or 12 years. He had to be the Ganden throne holder, as it's called, because of the dislocation, you know, Ling Rinpoche. And then he sort of balefully glared at me and he said, you too, he said, you won't have any free time yourself until the Dalai Lama's wishes are fulfilled. He gave me, so I've been operating under that kind of, I don't know, promise or curse. I consider it an honor, but people do accuse me of being a Buddhaholic, and maybe after this book they'll accuse me of being a Dalai-holic as well. But I am very inspired by the Dalai Lama. I think after knowing him, I have known him for 53 years, and I would say after about 25, I started having flashes of him being like Shakyamuni Buddha, you know, like I would see him. I remember when it hit me first really strongly was in San Jose, California, in a giant stadium where he was giving a medicine Buddha initiation and some teachings. And I was in a seat up in a stadium seat, and he was down there, and all these monks were swirling around him, and he was greeting them, and it was there was a lot of monks. I don't know why that particular day. And then it just was like Shakyamuni surrounded by the Sangha, you know, it was just totally was. If Shakyamuni were to manifest a humanoid body again at this time, which he doesn't really need to do, although he's present, according to Mahayana, he didn't leave. Shakyamuni did not leave. He would be the Dalai Lama. You know, we couldn't ask for better. And technically, right, the Dalai Lama is supposed to be, in Buddhist faith, Tibetan Buddhist faith, he's supposed to be the incarnation of the universal compassion of all Buddhas, right? And not the only one. The Karmapa is also one of them. There's many. Some of you might be one of them. You know, there are many Avalokiteshvaras. There's no limit to it's not like Jesus. You know, like it's not a one-shot deal like in the Christian tradition. The emanation body, they emanate many, many incarnations. You know. So that's the thing. Now, I thought I would just, you know, in a book signing, you do a little thing about reading from the book. So I thought I would just mention one thing, which is we actually, although this is the life of the 14th Dalai Lama, we start with the 13th Dalai Lama, 1904, because it's a particularly strong turning point where the British invade Tibet. And he flees to Mongolia, and he becomes the first, and then to China, because under the guise of there used to be a protectorate of the Manchu Empire, who the Tibetans never have considered to be Chinese, and the Manchus themselves don't consider. Don't sit in the very middle, okay? Yeah, no, not there, like one more over. That's good, right there, that's good. Because of this camera on the low level. So he went there, but the Dowager Empress was not very, you know, she was not wanting to honor the old Manchu thing. The Manchu Empire was really at its bitter end at that point. And so there's an exchange here where he goes in to meet her, and he's sitting in formal reception is held for him in Beijing with many European and American diplomats attending. He met Rockhill and these kind of people, W.W. Rockhill and some others, and Russians and all sorts of people. And he started seeing people he'd never seen. And then we have him in a thought bubble. See, this is the novel part, saying, oh, these Westerners may well be my protectors. And then at court, and then now he goes to court. You know, he's in Beijing, and she says, at court. What? Page 10. Oh. At court, the Empress no longer accords him the special honor given to previous Dalai Lamas, sternly demanding that the mentor kowtow to the patron. Because, the Manchu relationship was, they call it priest-patron relation in the political science people do, but that's not really a good idea. It's not just a priest. Lama means like a mentor, like a, soul governor or something. It's much more strong authority or someone than just a priest, So mentor and patron. But she wants the mentor to kowtow to the patron. So she says vice-regent, calls him vice-regent. In other words, she acts like they're governing Tibet directly, which they're not. And she says, Vice-regent, you are slow to acknowledge me. And he says, Your Majesty, I acknowledge your supreme authority, but I am the Dalai Lama of Tibet. We have maintained a relationship of mentor and patron throughout many incarnations for hundreds of years. He offers a compromise by sinking to one knee. And because she says, You must submit to my will, Vice-regent. Your Majesty, I acknowledge your preeminence, meaning the British at this time are occupying Lhasa, right? And he's been demoted in Lhasa and all this. But I remind you of my own authority. And then she says to him, and the artists went wild here, and they have her long, raking fingernails, claw-like metal empress fingernails. They suddenly get longer, and they look like an alien. I love it anyway. I would remind the Vice-regent of his present state. It is dangerous to risk my wrath, as he could be deposed. So then there's a very sweet scene in the next page where he goes with the Emperor Puyi, the one who the last emperor was about. And he actually took him first to the throne, gave him a blessing, kind of installed him a little bit, that last sort. But it was half-hearted because she already had deposed him, and she ordered some general in eastern Tibet to go and invade Tibet and kill him. And then he got the word and he escaped. And then he fled from her and from the Chinese, who invaded all the way to Lhasa at that time, fled to India and then came under the protectorate of the British instead, who he had originally fled from them to go away. So it sort of echoes the present Dalai Lama's thing. And it's very exciting how he goes. He has a flight across the mountains, escaping a Chinese army and so on.
And she dies.
Huh?
She dies,
she poisons her son, and she left it to a little kid. And when the empire collapsed in another year. So that was the end. When they no longer protected the Dalai Lama, the Manchu Empire collapsed. That's really funny, I think. Anyway, so, what?
Because she built the connection with him.
Well, I think it was going down the drain anyway. Yeah, she was not good. Anyway, so we start there because for a brief time, that 13th Dalai Lama, one thing though which reminds me of the present time, talking about the interaction of Tibet in the world, Standing Rock Tibet in the world, is that the 13th Dalai Lama then, after this, when he went back, when the Manchu Empire collapsed, and he denounced the 13th Dalai Lama, broke the protectorate relationship with the Manchus, proclaimed independence, and then the British frustrated him, and people don't know this, and Tibet was independent completely from 1913 until 1950. And it had postage stamps, currency, it was recognized by the Nepali, it was actually recognized by the British, but they don't admit it later. They pretend they didn't recognize them. It was recognized by Mongolia, which itself was a sovereign state at that time. It was not recognized by the nationalist Chinese, of course. They wanted to claim that they still owned everything that had been a protectorate, including Outer Mongolia and various parts of Siberia, that had been under protectorate had paid, tribute to the Manchu Empire. So, but then the British frustrated him, and they would not introduce Tibet to the League of Nations after the World War. They refused. And Churchill is the author of that refusal, Mr. Colonial himself, Churchill. And there's a thesis which we'll publish Tibet, that done by an Australian woman, showing how the British Raj people kept submitting petitions to the Foreign Ministry in London to let the Tibetans present their credentials at the League of Nations and let Tibet be recognized, to keep it a buffer state so neither the Russians or any future Chinese government could go in there and be on the Himalayan border of the Raj, the crown jewel, India. And Churchill said, no, it'll always be a buffer state because no one will want to go there. And why bother? And he instead executed the policy lobbied for by the Hong Kong British, Taipans, who used the card of saying, oh yeah, we know you guys, to any Chinese government, nationalist and eventually communist, saying, yeah, and Taiwan, whatever. Yeah, you guys can keep Tibet, no problem. We recognize that you own Tibet. They say, if you could, hello, hi, if you could move a little over, the next seat over. Oh, that's good. We're trying to keep the central channel open here. So the Brits actually, so that's really created the complication today, where the Chinese could invade. And when it was brought to the UN, the British ambassador said, they should not do that. They're not allowed to invade Tibet. Tibet is Tibet. It's not China. But then the next day he said, oh, wait, he got orders, a phone call from London. He said, oh, well, we're not sure. Maybe it is an internal affair. Because they always claim it's their internal affair, you see, the Chinese. So the seeds of that are here. That's why we started there, with the 13th Dalai Lama. And we have the other thing I thought would be interesting to compare, maybe you'd like to do that with him, would be the 13th Dalai Lama goes to the Buddhist holy sites in 1908, 9, 10, like that, or 9 and 10, I think, when he's a ward of the British. He's the guest of the British. He goes to Bodh Gaya. He sees sort of Indian Buddhist holy sites, and he's very impressed by it. But then he decides, praying for what should I do in this terrible situation with the Chinese threatening, Chinese invasion army, the British this and that, the other. And he got the insight, I think we need to have a defense force. 13th Dalai Lama against Chinese, because the guy who the Manchus had sent killed a lot of people. It was a terrible slaughter in 1904, 1908, 9, the invasion of that guy. And then this echoes with 13th Dalai Lama when he goes in 1956, and he has a pilgrimage to all the places, and then he meets Gandhi on pages 82 and 83. He has visions of Gandhi, and he completely goes for the nonviolence, and he refuses Truman's half-hearted offer to wage a front in Tibet against the Red Chinese, like the one in Korea that was just being opened at the same time in 1950. There were some people in the American government who wanted to have a back front, in the hills there, trying to keep the Chinese, push them back out of Tibet. But Dalai Lama didn't believe in it, and Nehru said he would never allow India to be party to it. And so, there was really, it was not practical, I felt, the Dalai Lama felt. And also the invitation Truman wrote to him wasn't signed. So he didn't, so anyway, his brothers wanted to get involved with the CIA, which they did, but he never blessed it, and he was against it from the beginning and told them it didn't think it would work, and so on. But it wasn't because Buddhists can't defend themselves. His predecessor at that time had felt it would be important to have a bit of a defense force, which he tried to form to some extent, but he was not really able to do that. So therefore, Tibet maintained its demilitarized condition that it had been in for several centuries, relying on the diplomacy of the Dalai Lamas and the protectorate of the Manchus. And that no longer worked in the modern period, which is why the 13th wanted their own defense force, but the monks wouldn't give up their budget to a military budget. And so that it didn't happen. So anyway, this is the kind of thing that you will learn. One of my times, of course, William, we've known, how long have we known each other now? William, been working together about 10 years? More than 10. 15? Since 1994. Oh, so you have 13 years, so you have a great count. That's a lucky number, 13. That's really good, because we're just getting started doing other books. But, what? 23 years. What's 23 years? Since we first met, 1994. Oh, that's 23 years? Oh, my God. Tibetan mathematics. Yeah, but did you already introduce this book idea to me 23 years ago, you mean? Oh. So anyway, we've been puttering at it because we never had funding until very, very recently. And we had a Tibetan artist work with us, who semi-volunteer at first, and then too expensive for us and too slow. And then finally we got a grant about 2 years ago now, I think. And the grant enabled us to get the wonderful 5 artists that you'll see on the cover page, who did the marvelous illustrations. What, 1 Jordanian, 1 Russian, and 3 Americans. Is that right?
Yeah, 3.
I think so.
A woman in Utah.
Yeah.
And a Malaysian.
What?
One guy from Malaysia.
Oh, Kinsun is in Malaysia, not in Jordan. Oh, I thought he was in Malaysia. I see. Yeah, Kinsun. So anyway, this is it. And the other thing is, we wanted the Dalai Lama to have deniability. That's the third reason. I had forgotten the third reason. In this plausible deniability, in the sense that, you know, the Tibetans are up a terrible creek. It's like the Standing Rock, right? You know, the president is an idiot, and he's an investor in the pipeline company, and, you know, he wants to crush them and crush anybody. You know, that's his thing. And so the Dalai Lama is sort of in that situation with the Chinese. But then there are factions in the Tibetan government in exile, even though His Holiness is no longer officially a member of the government in exile, but still he's the leader of the Tibetans. He's in a position where people might complain if his statements that he made during various terrible times when the Chinese were particularly violent with the Tibetans, 2007 and 8, and since, earlier periods, very, very harsh, the 1993 type of 4 or 5, around that time of the Panchen Lama thing, and back and back and back. You know, you can go all the way back to the 50s. And they don't like him to to offend the Chinese leaders. They have this concept that the Chinese, if they lose face, then like the Westerners do, then they'll never recover, you know. And so we felt to show the Dalai Lama's greatness about how he cleaves to world peace and to nonviolent reaction to genocide, actually. You have to show a little bit of the genocide, that he's aware of it. And so we use some sentences from his March 10th speeches where he's reacting year by year to the atrocious news coming to him out of Tibet. And also we show some of the activity that goes on there. And we show some harsh Tibetan revolutionaries. And for that I'm a little less inclined to show that sort of thing. But my friend William is very well read in all the guerrilla stuff and all that, much better than I am. And he insisted we keep a certain amount of that in, and I agreed with him ultimately. I accepted that idea, and we felt it, because it shows to react nonviolently when your own people are being really badly, harshly done, out of principle, even though you're capable. Buddhists, it's not that Buddhists are incapable of fighting to defend themselves. There is a Buddhist theory, there's no Buddhist theory of a just war, but for years I said academically in my younger days going to conferences and things that the Buddhists had no theory of any kind of just army. But they do, but it's of just defense. And their theory of just defense is that if you're invaded and you can expel the invader, you're strong enough. You should, because that will minimize violence. You don't pursue the invader back into their country. You then impose a treaty on them, you know, for having tried to invade you. If you can't resist because they're much too powerful, don't resist, because by the violence of the fight on their way in, they'll be more vicious when they get in, and it will increase violence. So it's like a pragmatic thing like that. In other words, if being surgically violent to prevent more violence will work, then it's pragmatically allowable under the Buddhist nonviolence thing. If it won't work, then just sort of throw yourself in the teeth of the overwhelming enemy is considered stupid, because then you will hurt some of them, and then they'll be much more nasty to your fellow people, and it'll be terrible. So there is such a theory, and obviously the 13th was aware of that and was hoping to defend the eastern borders from when he foresaw that the invasion would come again from China. So, okay, so that's it. So now I'm going to turn the mic over to William. Okay?
Okay. Well, what Bob was talking about was a conflict that's an undercurrent throughout the whole book, the conflict between the adherence to nonviolence, which the Dalai Lama holds to. He realizes that there is, practically speaking, there is no way that they can resort to any kind of violence, surgical or otherwise, that wouldn't bring down intolerable persecution on the Tibetans themselves, and of course the persecution has been coming down on them anyway, regardless of the nonviolence. But that's, as I say, that's something that runs throughout the book, the going back and forth between the story of His Holiness trying to get to bring peace, to get a political agreement that would bring peace to and some kind of liberation or independence for Tibet, and the other side being the violent resistance called the Chushi Gangdruk, which had been fighting the Chinese throughout the first few years of their after the Dalai Lama went into exile. But I wrote a few notes here. This undercurrent that.
You're going to share your story a little bit? Good.
Yeah, the undercurrent that runs throughout this book is that of the patience and fortitude that must accompany a determined adherence to the practice of nonviolence. Basically, how much are you willing to endure for the sake of preserving a peaceful world, for the sake of hanging on to the Buddhist ethic of doing no harm to any creature? And that question is explored in depth throughout the book, and up to and including self-immolation, which is, an extreme form of nonviolence. It's violence to yourself in order to make a statement without being violent to anybody else. And that leads finally to a future return, that leads in the end of the book to a future return of the Dalai Lama to Tibet. It's projected into the future, his return to Tibet and all Tibetans returning to Tibet, devoted to the practice of health and healing and turning Tibet into one great spa for humanity, which, could really use it at this point. Which leads me to a passage in the current Tibet House newsletter that I think is very relevant to this whole subject too. If I could just read that, just a short paragraph. What better time than now for the preeminent living man of peace to be presented to world consciousness as an alternative to the breakdown of democracies and the rise of authoritarian dictatorships enabled by violence and war. Our man of peace, the 14th Dalai Lama of Tibet, emanates the countervailing Buddhistic virtues of humility, tolerance, equanimity, compassion, and love. A devotion to truth and justice that could call for civil disobedience is underpinned by an adherence to nonviolence in the peaceful revolution of any conflict. So I think the Dalai Lama really stands out in the world at this point for being probably the strongest exemplar of nonviolence on the planet. And that's the whole point of the book, and that's how. And so he ends. The book ends with him leading the movement back to Tibet to a peaceful emanation for the whole planet. I guess what I would like to express personally here. What I would like to express personally is, I guess, an emotion of just of gratitude to everyone here for starters, for coming here to hear this. But this whole project began as an expression of gratitude to His Holiness, who at a time back in the early 90s, before I joined forces with Bob, my family had went through a pretty extreme crisis, which involved a terminal diagnosis, and we just happened through karma, a little luck, a little exertion of willpower on my wife's part. We connected with him, and he invited us to India to explore Tibetan medicine. And we ended up having an audience with him that was really, truly extraordinary, and like basically a condensed teaching on the essence of life and death, and what we could expect from Tibetan medicine, and what we couldn't expect from it, depending on the state of our karma. But in any case, we were so grateful to him. Well, for one thing, it was like it elevated us out of our state of despair, and gave us a whole new reason for living and being together. It elicited a tremendous love, and we ended up living on an island quite remote from anybody else, and thought about how we could appreciate, how we could express our gratitude to His Holiness for having done that for us, no matter what was going to happen next. So we came up with the idea of a graphic novel, because we had kids who were exploring, what they were reading was comic books and graphic novels, and we wanted our kids to understand fully what we saw in Buddhism and the Dalai Lama, and why this whole experience had been so incredibly, profoundly important to us. So we decided that we would begin this project telling the story of His Holiness, his life, and as well as the modern history of the Tibetans, a life of the modern Tibetans and the Dalai Lama, and his leading them throughout all the persecution they've had to endure. Which brings us around to when I joined forces with you and brought up the idea of doing such a book. And Bob was very enthusiastic about it. A lot of people were, but it took many years to finally come up with the right combination of financial backing and the right artists to illustrate it. And so after, I guess what? Well, actually it was, there was the real breakthrough was when we were hiking on the trail at Menla, and I started talking about graphic novels with Michael, who is also very much into graphic. He was a publisher of graphic novels himself. And so the combination of me and Michael managed to get Bob further into it to join forces with us. And at that point, Bob being the expert fundraiser that he is, we managed to get the funding for the book. And that was like over 5 years ago, and it's taken us this long to produce it. And now here it is, the culmination of this incredible journey, and I'm just thankful not only to the Dalai Lama, but to my fellow creators, our artists, and to all of you for being so supportive and positive about it, and actually coming out here to hear more about it.
Perspective?
Thank you. So, I got it. I am the mic. I like to joke that I am the mic when you ask me to use a mic. thank you, William. And I'd also jotted down some scattered remarks myself. So I'm really fired up about this book. It's taken us 6 years of intense, devoted effort. Bob is the epitome of enthusiasm and the can-do attitude, which is infectious and contagious. And
I was younger.
I was younger too. And so this to me was a no-brainer when William told me about it. I was doing my own projects with graphic novels, and my wife actually helped teach me how to letter, which is how I actually interface primarily with this project. So we had no budget, and we had to do our own using illustrators, so we learned how to letter ourselves. And I want to give a shout out to letterers everywhere. It's like the least acknowledged part of a graphic novel, and it's pretty important, I learned. And I got an amazing education from Steve Buccellato, who was the genius who coordinated the art team and was one of the main elements for this really coming together the way that it did.
It's horrible when some people are changing all the dialogues that you're lettering.
I lettered this book 4 times. Could have saved it all till the last year and a half, but that's how I got an education in lettering, and it was such a treat. I have to say it was like an amazing honor and experience for me to be a part of this. And I studied Buddhism in college with Bob, and that's how I got involved with Menla, where I work now and have worked for 15 years. And I somehow was so obsessed with the philosophy and Buddhism that I forgot to study the history. And so this, to me, was an opportunity to learn the history that I was vaguely aware of. And my guess is that most people in this country have, heard of the Dalai Lama. They've maybe heard of Tibet. If you watch John Oliver's segment,
How many people saw John Oliver's thing?
which was a masterpiece.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you, John Oliver.
Anybody who didn't see it, you should see it on YouTube. It'll blow your mind.
18 minutes, I couldn't believe it, and coinciding with this coming out. So really, people don't really know what happened in Tibet. They may be aware that there was an invasion or that there's some genocide is sometimes said, but the story isn't really very well known. So to me, this was a story about the Dalai Lama's life, which in and of itself is truly amazing and inspiring. But it was also like a Trojan horse to get the story out of the true story of what happened in Tibet. And it's the same kind of story that we see again and again throughout the world, as Bob alluded to. In the case of Tibet, it's particularly like black and white because they were such a peaceful people. The Chushigundruk resistance, to me, was amazing. It was like the last Native Americans standing up to the Comanche on horseback, fiercely going against numbers way beyond their capacity to stave off. And they did a good job in spite of the Dalai Lama's telling them that it was going to be futile. It was his own brothers working with the CIA, which is an interesting sub-story, who tried to foment this resistance and keep the Chinese at bay. And they may have had a chance of succeeding if the U.S. hadn't pulled out and gotten involved in Korea. Anyway, that's a subplot. But to me, this is exciting because history can be really boringly taught. But I think that this is a great way for all generations, from probably about the age of 10 or 12 on up, to learn in bite-sized bits about actual history. And we slipped some philosophy in there. My favorite section is the Kala Chakra section, which we get into philosophy. And there's some amazing artwork. But to me, the graphic novels are the fastest growing sector in the publishing industry, I'm told, and it's not by accident. We have like 9-second attention spans nowadays, I think. I heard just yesterday in my 9 seconds of paying attention to that report. And I happened to be sitting next to a Tibetan couple on the way to India when we went for the Kala Chakra. And the woman saw my book. I didn't realize they were Tibetan, and she asked if she could borrow it for the flight. And she read the whole thing over the course of the flight, and she told me at the end that she doesn't ever read long books, and this is a long book, 300 pages. But she said she couldn't stop reading it, and she was very grateful it had been put in this form because she herself could muster the attention span to get through the whole thing. So the Dalai Lama is like a spiritual action hero, and he's the incarnation of compassion, which he, of course, is very cagey about. He dodges those accusations from his people that he's the incarnation of. So we do get, we do say it, sort of, and but it really lends itself to one man versus an empire in a graphic novel form, I think, very nicely. I know the choices that I faced at age 15 were like, which classes am I going to take, and can I possibly get the courage to ask this girl out, or something like this. The Dalai Lama at age 15 was faced with, what do I do with my nation being invaded by a military empire? And that's just the start of his remarkable career, making incredibly difficult decisions on behalf of a lot of people other than himself. And so it's really a pleasure to see it articulated in this way here. It's also definitely a small miracle that this book was made, and I just want to acknowledge the people who behind the scenes, including the very generous donations made, particularly by one person, but by a number of people who made it possible for us to retain the art team. This was a professional group of people, hired guns for Marvel, DC, and various other comic book publishing companies, and they worked as independent contractors with us to execute this. And this, to them, I think, was, according to Steve, was a really unusual and exceptional opportunity to be a part of something very meaningful. So I'd like to just include them in my own remarks here. And Rob Carr, the Tibetan artist, I'd like to mention by name. He was he's a brilliant Tibetan artist, fairly young. He was trained as a Tibetan monk for 10 years, and he helped do some of the gorgeous artwork at Menla's Mahasukha Spa, and he did the initial couple of chapters, rough draft, first round of artwork, and did layouts and things that ended up being utilized in, some of the layouts are very inspired and they're very Tibetan in flavor. So even though we had a non-Tibetan art team, his aesthetic sort of set the tone for how the book was executed from an art direction standpoint. And then I wanted to mention the genius portrait by Alex Gray on the cover. This was a portrait that was done by Alex in the mid-90s for this book, and Alex was, somehow William met Alex at that time, and Alex got really inspired by the vision and wanted to do the art for the book. And Tibet House was like 7 years old at the time, and was unable to provide the funds that it would take to retain Alex for a couple of years. He was busy fundraising for his own efforts. But he did this incredible portrait, which, if you haven't seen it before, do take a close look at it. It's the Dalai Lama, of course, bowing to you, which is very humble and very appropriate. And he's in front of his palace in Lhasa, the capital of Tibet, which, of course, has been seized by the Chinese for a long time, and is now like a tourist attraction. But we explain the significance of that building in the first chapter of the book. But also, my favorite part is the Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion with the 1,000 arms, which represents the infinite ways of being able to give to others and serve others, transposed on the Dalai Lama's as if it were his halo. And this image had a profound impact on me when I was quite young. And I had a whole vision that I'm not going to go into now, but essentially what struck me when I had a serious moment with this was that His Holiness is acknowledging you in this, whereas we always acknowledge him. And he's acting sort of, or being presented as kind of a mirror. And I think that's very empowering to those of us who may have low self-esteem or who look to others for leadership. He wants us to be the leaders too. So, and I think we get that in some of the subtext of the story. And then I covered that. Then I think the epilogue at the end, we had.
Come and sit down, by the way. You like, you can sit down.
Just not in the central channel. The epilogue, we had already gotten to like an almost 300-page book by the time we got to actually executing the epilogue, and we were being chastised in a friendly way by Bob's wife, Nena, and rightly so. So we kept the epilogue short, but it deserves its own like follow-up graphic novel, because it's really what we had initially thought about potentially doing was a dual prophecy of Tibet. Like if the clampdown and the destruction continues the way that it is, you know, by the time I was in class with you almost 20 years ago, 80% of the forests had been cut down. So by now I'm guessing 100% of the old growth forests.
They could only cut down the parts they can throw in rivers that flow into China. If they get Arunachal Pradesh back from India, which they claim they own, then those are the rivers that flow into India. So they'd have to truck them. The rail system and everything, they'd have to truck the wood out. So that's why that's a left. Otherwise, it'd all be gone.
Right, I see. So, but in other words, the dual prophecy would then follow. We were thinking like the dark future on the left side pages and the positive future, which is Holiness sees, and which we see as being very really possible, because the current campaign in Tibet is unsustainable financially, morally, practically. That they can't relocate Chinese successfully up to the plateau. They go into miscarriages, they have lung problems, they can only be there for so many months out of the year, and it's just an unsustainable campaign. And the gig is up in the world, on the world stage. We sort of know what they're up to as much as they try to continue with the propaganda and the lies. And do look for some negative reviews, because I think they're going to do a little backlash. But so far we've gotten very positive reviews, and we need your help. If you read the book and you like the book, you can send constructive criticism to our emails and give us those 5-star reviews on Amazon, and that's going to help justify a second printing, because you know, this is one book among many that are being released into the public. So we need the support of people who already understand the value of this cause to take a couple minutes out of their busy lives and say something positive, and that will help, and that'll keep this book in circulation for years to come. And the 21st century can be the century of peace, as His Holiness likes to say. And then and that's about. Oh, and then I thought maybe you could address a couple of anecdotes, because what was so awesome about working with you on this was getting the anecdotes and the sort of the behind the scenes. It's like you were there for a lot of these, you know, you were saying like, I remember this here. It's not just reading it out of a book. So I thought in particular, if you could just maybe talk about the vision that you had of Hayagriva. That's a really particularly cool one that made it into the book.
Well, that's a very daring one.
Which you put in the book.
That's one thing I wanted to say, then we honor very
Thank you.
much inspired by Tsering Oser, if you know who she is. Tsering Oser is a woman with a Chinese father and a Tibetan mother, lives in Beijing, married to a Chinese gentleman. Please come and try to sit down, anybody who is here. It's okay, we're not in church yet. She wrote a very moving book called Tibet on Fire, published in England. And we quote from her here in the middle of this page, from Tsering Oser, Tibet on Fire. And we honor around 150, I think, here, of those who are. But by the way, in the Tibetan language, I think this is very important, they don't call it self-immolation. They call it offering one's body in flames. They call it Ranglu Mela Power or Ranglu Mela Sakpa, you know. So it's the body they're giving. We are giving away a body. They consider their self goes through the generosity of the gift of their life, like in a heroic, martyrish kind of sacrificial thing. It will go to a little even better future life, you know, be reborn in a free Tibet or in some other realm. Actually, just like the suicide bombers, actually. These are the Buddhist suicide bombers. They don't hurt other people. That's the difference. So they are the ultimate warrior in a way of nonviolence in a certain way, in that they say there is this terrible violence going on, which is genocide. So I'm not going to join it, and I'm not going to allow anybody to kill me for my beliefs, which are for the Dalai Lama, which then they are killing Tibetans for hold the Dalai Lama as they are something important, or their Buddhism is more important than the Chinese state. They do torture them and kill them, these guys who express that. So they're saying, you can't, I'm still a free man, and I can give my body to show you that this thing of dominating other bodies, this conquering of others, type of society that you guys are caught in, you Chinese guys, is not worth it. So I'm going to a better life myself, but I'm not hurting you. I could go blow up a station. I could put on a suicide vest and go. The Tibetans are very good in rigging any kind of jet rigging, jury rigging, some sort of thing. They could do that, but they're not. So they're on it. But those of you who saw the John Oliver one, His Holiness said that he was against this happening, and he is. If anybody, one of these people had asked His Holiness, should I do this? He would say, no, absolutely not. If you're suffering a lot now by being pushed around and tortured, you use that suffering to develop your patience and to practice the Dharma. But you shouldn't kill yourself. Your human body is too valuable and too precious. Try to, use the suffering in another way. But on the other hand, once they do it, he can't condemn them, because they are kind of hero, and they are like a commando. They're like a warrior. But they're giving their body away to show that clutching onto your own body is not the main point of life. You're going to die anyway, actually. But I happen to be the first one who started this, a guy in Delhi who had lived in Dharamsala, actually, who was an ex-monk and ex-soldier, and who was working as a cook, actually, in Dharamsala. But then he went to Delhi and he was going to do this fasting thing with them. And then the Indians dragged them away and intravenously fed them. But so to avoid that, so he would be able to give his life, this guy, Thurman of his name, he burned his body. And then he was taken to a hospital, and His Holiness went to see him before he died, while he was like a mummy, all bandaged in the hospital. And so I think we show the scene here, actually. And I happened to meet him because he came, when he first got here, right after that, he was on his way here. Came from Dharamsala to Delhi, saw the guy, told him, okay, you made a statement, I wish you hadn't done this. He said, but now if you pass, which it looks like you might, don't die with hatred for the Chinese in your heart. You have to make it equal with them. They don't know what they're doing. You die with generosity and thinking about that rather than any anger or revenge or whatever it might be. And there was like a nod, vigorous nod from the guy the Dalai Lama told me. And then the Dalai Lama told me about 2 days later in Lincoln Center, where I met him, he said that he was very frightened by it because he was afraid it would catch on among Tibetans. And he said the type of level of energy that someone gets to when they want to do this could also lead to actual harming others, like suicide bombing, like, violence. And he didn't want that. So this is this odd, complicated thing where you have to hesitate. But Teresa herself, right there living in Beijing, under Ai Weiwei, under the thumb of them, she says, memories are intertwined with these flames. The heroes who have sacrificed their bodies to the flames will remain with us as long as we cherish their memory. I join my hands in prayer for my compatriots who have committed these painful acts of sacrifice. I hold them, their memories, and their aspirations in the deepest and most profound respect, now and forever. Saying Özer. She's a really great person, actually. She fearlessly writes about what goes on in Tibet, in Chinese. And then they put her on house arrest and do this and that. They haven't busted her completely yet. So that's one of the things. And then on the more cheery side, there's all this stuff with the different Deng Xiaoping and Mao, and then Nixon and Kissinger are incredible.
Such a great scene. The only curse word in the book is the Kissinger and Nixon scene.
Yeah, they want to invade. He sent an aircraft carrier to Bangladesh, remember, and they were supporting Yahya Khan. You guys are too young to remember that. All the terrible atrocities that the West Pakistanis did to the Bengalis before they became Bangladesh. And they were really mad about the idea that Pakistan might lose. They liked Pakistan, they hated India, Nixon and Kissinger. And they especially didn't like Indira Gandhi. They had say some terrible things about her, which we know that they did say. Anyway, I hope Kissinger doesn't sue us. And then this is the part you like, where the Dalai Lama The Dalai Lama, this world Kalachakra for world peace that he does, we show how this happened in a way, because usually a Dalai Lama or Panchen Lama or other Lama, but very few actually do Kalachakra, because it's an elaborate, the mandala and everything, the color particle mandala takes a lot of doing, and they have to be artists trained enormously to do all of the rituals involved with it. And so they usually do once or twice in a lifetime. But when he was first out in the in the 60s, he had some visions of Mrs. Kalachakra, the one called Vishvamata, the Universal Mother. And she told him, you should do a lot of Kalachakras. You can spread Kalachakras wide as you want. You go right ahead. Don't worry about it. And so he's done that, and he's up to, we were just at the 34th. We were at the 34th. We were at the 30th. Ours was the 34th in Bodh Gaya. And there might be, and then always everyone is the last one. Actually, I'm at one of the early ones, not the first, but one of the early ones. I'm in the book here with my wife and so on. Oh, you wanted me to talk about this page. By the way, that was supposed to be the last one, 1971, January 9th, 1971. That was supposed to be the last one then. That was like the fourth one, or third one. Oh yeah, so this is the one Mike wants me to talk about. And this is the other thing about graphic novel. Where is it now?
Other way.
Other way? No. Oh, yeah, 1970. You're right. 1971.
Right here. No, the wrong one. Sorry. It's the,
Here.
there you
Well, this
Page
is
171.
I don't know if I should really tell this story, but this is a strange story. See, this is the kind of thing Dalai Lama would never, he would not like to claim any kind of ownership of this. But this is Hayagriva. I don't know if any of you ever know what Hayagriva is. The fierce form of Avalokiteshvara. When you say Om Mani Padme Hum Shri, the sound Shri, the mantra Shri is the seed sound of Hayagriva. And Hayagriva's root mantra is Om Padma Sambhava Hum. So he's actually also connected to Guru Rinpoche, Padma Sambhava. And Dalai Lama is very fond of Hayagriva, and he really likes Hayagriva. And I do too, actually. And this has happened in 1971 when Russia and China were at war, and Bangladesh and India and West Pakistan were at war. And it was a really wild and dangerous time. Nixon arrested a whole bunch of people that summer of '71 in the Redskins Stadium. He had like a huge bunch of protesters arrested there. So it was because of his bombing of wherever. So it was a whole scene. And I had this dream. I was in the Himalayas that summer, and I guess I was a little agitated by Allen Ginsberg telling me about all the things that were going on here. He came by where we were in the Himalayas. And I had this dream where Nixon and Brezhnev made a plan to get Mao and nuke China, before Mao could raise a decent nuclear response. And, the Russians are actually the natural, heavier enemies of the Chinese than anybody, because they have this long border, land border, and they are 6 times the population and all this. Anyway, that's the case. They're very backward on their yellow peril thing, much worse than even us. And so they had a plan to Nixon and Brezhnev. Nixon was disagreeing with Kissinger, who wanted to play the China card. And so he had this secret deal with Brezhnev. I had in the dream. This is a dream. And the Kremlin and White House were all hooked up, and they were pressing buttons. And then in the dream, I saw Hayagriva go up there in the sky, somewhere where he could see White House and Kremlin, and Europe in between, and China over here, sort of high up. And he threw his head forward, and his hair went into all the electronic connections, into all the computers of those days, whatever they were. And so the Russians were pressing buttons, and the only thing that was still alive was the red phone between Brezhnev and Nixon. And they were doing all the right things to trigger the assault that the U.S. was going to let Russians do. And nothing happened. Hayagriva's hair prevented any kind of impulses from going across the wires, totally. And then, as I was awaking from the dream, I sort of saw the Dalai Lama. I was in a hill station about 3 hours away from Dharamsala at that time. So I kind of could see Dalai Lama meditating, like this. He was just meditating. He wasn't the Hayagriva. Hayagriva was up there, you know. And then I saw Zhou Enlai, who somehow knew that this happened. And Zhou Enlai was laughing at the Dalai Lama on this sort of different plane. And he's saying, you see, you can't even let your enemies get wasted. Ha, 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 you know? In other words, Zhou Enlai was laughing, taking advantage of the nonviolent thing. And then the Hayagriva here says, no bombing it back to the Stone Age. And look at these two guys. Oh, and then, yeah, just before seeing those two things, I could see into the roof of the White House and the Kremlin. And then I noticed that the two of them were pressing different kinds of buttons. And they're missile buttons, and it looked like they were masturbating, actually. Because they were like going like this, and nothing was happening. So they were going like... Shooting blanks. So anyway, it's entirely my dream. But this is like where Dalai Lama wouldn't start a major boycott in the around 89-90 when he just got Nobel Prize, and there was a sort of Tibet seemed to really be coming out, and China was on the ropes there, you know, and he got the Nobel Peace Prize. He wouldn't do that. He wouldn't say no to the Chinese having the Olympics. He's always wanted to benefit the Chinese as well as everybody else, in spite of the genocide that the inane leadership is committing, still committing. And today, even, I sometimes call it ethnocide, which I made up that word. I think it's a great word, though. Ethnocide. Nobody uses it. They say ethnic cleansing, but actually it's ethnocide. And then there's genocide, you know, which is close to the same thing. But there's nothing personal about it from the Chinese. There's a little racism between Chinese and Tibetans, if you actually know them, if you've ever been around them on the ground, in Chengdu, a place like that. But it's not really that. It's that China has to pretend in the world system that they always own Tibet, and so the Tibetans are just a kind of Chinese. So the refutation of that are the living, breathing Tibetans who have no such culture as the Chinese, and they don't identify as the Chinese. And not only that, but your Chinese from Sichuan, they don't identify Tibetans as a fellow Chinese. They simply don't. It's a colonial situation. It can only be a colonial situation. And it's particularly hard because no Chinese can live year-round in Tibet with the safe health because they get CMS, chronic mountain sickness, by both males and females, and they all go down for a month or two every year, those who work up there, at least. And so that Dalai Lama would never put that in autobiography. And if I said that, he would say, what is that? That's crazy. Don't do that. But I don't know anything about that. But he does invoke Hayagriva, actually. He does, hoping for the good. Now, finally, I want to say one last thing, if I could. But anybody, you guys chime in with anything, although hold the mic here. And that is, last thing I want to say is, right now, we're in the worst moment, it seems, on the planet. Climate denying, pipelines, like we're already losing their health insurance. Act of mercy to remove 24 million people from the health rolls by an Ayn Rand disciple. I mean, really, we're really in the pits right now. And in 1914, after Tibet had declared independence, and then the British let it be known they wouldn't let the Dalai Lama go to the 13th Dalai Lama, go to the League of Nations to present the existence of Tibet, which was really the beginning of the genocide, really. They don't exist as a people. They're not a nation. They don't have their own nation in the British colonial imperial game, you know. So, you know, I always used to say and used to think that Tibet could not be free within the existing world system, which is still left over from the colonial era, if you will. Even India, you know, the capital of India, where the prime minister lives and all these people, the South Block, you know, the foreign ministry, is built by Inigo Jones. It's a British building. It has Greek pillars and so forth. And the Tamils and the Keralis and the UP people and the Punjabis, these are all, the Bengalis, they're different people, actually. And so they were only put together as empire. And they're, lucky for them, they're pretty decentralized in quite a few respects, which is very lucky. Similarly, China is trying to reproduce the Manchu Empire, and it's being colonial in these different places. And we Americans, some people would accuse us of being colonial in our own ways, but in a way we were kind of supposedly the moral high ground and the exception. But that was blown away by our illegal invasion of Iraq, the first stolen election, and then illegal invasion of Iraq. And then, Obama, dear Obama, I love him dearly, but he didn't quite, protect certain people, as we're clearly seeing what is happening now. And so even our system then, and then second stolen election, and our system is kind of, what can we say, we're Democrats, and we are government of the people and by the people and for the people today? I don't think so, actually. I think we've been radically compromised. And why? 50% of our population doesn't vote. If 75% voted, there would never be such a complete lunatics in charge. I don't mean just one, all of them. So the ones who sat there for 8 years and wouldn't allow Obama to function, and it wouldn't do their job, and turned over our country to money. We are, I warned Dalai Lama in 2001 in a conference that we don't have in the book. It was about spirituality and democracy. And during which conference I begged him, please retain the position of the Dalai Lama. Whether you train somebody in a different way, okay, don't make him a Gelugpa, have him be like completely, overtly non-sectarian, however you do it, but maintain a spiritual figurehead like, the Queen of England or the King of Sweden or whatever. They just go and open parliament ritually, and they have a kind of moral authority, and then your prime ministers don't attract too much charisma, and you don't do this. I said, if you don't do that, Tibetan politicians will start behaving badly. And don't imitate America. We're a theocracy, I told him. And he said, what do you mean, theocracy or democracy? I said, no, we're a theocracy. And, well, what God? He said, I said, money, mammon. Well, first I said mammon, and he didn't know what that was. So money rules America. And the parliamentary system with no spiritual thing will be taken over by money because politicians are for sale, as we see, So he used the final argument in Tibetan debate to shut me up, which was, he said, shut up. Because I begged, he said he didn't want to be a figurehead. He said, I don't want to be a prisoner like Lady Di. He said he was impressed by poor Diana. And then I said, well, Tibetans will re-volunteer your next life, don't worry. And he says, shut up. In Tibetan, it's kadam. So he said, meaning don't put ideas in the Tibetans' minds. Anyway, so this is Tibet House Mission. Why we adopted this after, I guess, 23 years ago, when William brought it to our attention, in a way, because the Dalai Lama, to really understand the Dalai Lama, what he represents on the planet, not only for the Tibetan people, but in a way, he's a global Dalai Lama now. He's not in the top 10 anymore right now, because they've been suppressing his PR a little bit, the Chinese. He used to be in the top 10, he was above Benedict, but he was below Angelina.
Top 10 what?
Top 10 popular people in these international polls. They do Reuters and people like that. I think lately he didn't make the top 10, but he's probably in the top 20.
He was
popular people in the world.
He was 6 according to John Oliver, but that may have been just America.
No. Internationally? Well, then maybe he's still number 6. Okay. Yeah, he's still number 6. He was way ahead of Hu Jintao. I don't think Xi Jinping will not be competing, which is so silly of them. If they would just be friends of his, if they would give the Tibetans a break and become friends of the Dalai Lama, their popularity would go zooming up. If only they would get good PR advice instead of some antediluvian weirdo colonials. Anyway, that's another story. Okay, so I think that's it. Yeah, any questions? Yes.
Did the Dalai Lama himself have any creative or editorial input in the book? And regardless, I'm assuming he's seen it, and what did he say? What were his feelings, comments? Did the Dalai Lama have any editorial or creative input into the book? And what were his feelings once it was released?
I showed it to him at an earlier stage, a few pages, a few things. But he purposely didn't ask me to leave him all the pages. And actually, I was happy about that because, once had we done that, and then it would then spread around Dharamsala, these pages. And then there are people who are part of what we call the appeasement faction in the Tibetan government in exile, who are so desperate for some crumb to be thrown to them by the Chinese Imperium that they wouldn't want to show Chinese shooting some slave workers in the 60s and 50s that they were using to build roads and things, and dams and things like that. They wouldn't want that to be seen, so then there'd be a big hullabaloo about it. And I think he knew that, because he said, oh, yeah, okay, you do it, yes, okay, fine, no problem. You do it, he said. But then he likes to debate with me. We debate. Like, he saw this one picture, and he'd just been at a conference where they had anti-nuke conference, where they were talking about how we're in worse state than we were in the Cold War. And he saw this page. He saw this page. And what that is, the deity in the cloud is Yama, the Indian god of death. And the Buddhist...
It's Hiroshima being bombed by the Americans.
Hiroshima, when the Dalai Lama is 10 years of age. He's in Tibet, and Hiroshima happens, and he sees it on a newsreel, and eventually. And that's a Yama, and the god of death. So when the Dalai Lama saw that, he said, oh, you're making that nuclear explosion like a deity. He's like immediately challenging me. And so I said, well, that's Yama, he's causing a lot of death there, I said. And that's before Manjushri puts him under control. But I otherwise didn't argue with him. So, he said. But then he didn't quite, because there was a lot of people around, and he didn't quite that. And then a little bit later, when he was going to the car toward the end of that particular event, he looks at me and says, oh, I get it. Yeah, that's Yama untamed, he said. He did say to me. So he likes to debate. I mean, I'm sure he and I would have debated a lot of things. He would have freaked over that high agreement one. That's the most extreme one. He would just, when he would see us honoring the body offerers, the body burners, he would have kind of worried about that. Are we sanctioning it? Are we being accused of enlisting or recruiting more people, things like that? But he might have worried about it, but he agrees with that he honors them himself, but would never tell anyone. He says, don't do it, and he said, it's not effective, it's not helping us. And look at that. The people ascribe the Arab Spring to the one Tunisian fruit seller who burned himself, remember? Street vendor. And then the Tibetans, when they were around in the 80s, they were saying, what is with us? There's 80 of us, and nobody moves a muscle, And of course, the Chinese suppressed. It would actually very much move. Now, actually, Chinese Buddhists very much have a tradition of offering your body in flames. And it's in certain sutras, in a few rare places in Buddhist thing. Someone who gives their body as an offering, like a lamp of generosity to show their transcendence of their attachment to the body. But, it's the kind of thing, when they tell the story about it, they say, don't try this at home. They have a thing like that. But don't try this yourself. This is a guy who's capable of that. And they're living so lightly in their connection to their own body that it's not suffering for them even. It's blissful. And but Chinese Buddhism follows those things, and there's a history, like the Vietnamese guy, Vietnamese Buddhism has a very strong influence from Chinese Mahayana. So Chinese understand this, and the Chinese people would resonate. And so they're very desperate to, their whole thing about taking away people's cell phones, turning off cell towers, whenever one of these happens, mostly in eastern Tibet, the Chinese, is they don't want this to go out into their own media. Because then their people would say, wait, what is that? Is the Buddhists up there? What's causing them to want to do that? Right.
However, the Dalai Lama did, William asked him, right, you and Mary asked if it would be okay to do this back in,
originally. Okay.
and he said, if you think it'll help other people, then yes, go ahead.
He said, fine, he told me to go ahead.
And then you were fired up by the comment he made in France about...
I was worried all along that there'd be a big reaction from the government in exile. But when Dalai Lama was in France, somehow the French are not playing the polite game. The French are always so different. So he always goes to the parliament there and talks to the French parliament. The Chinese even don't make a big noise because they know the French won't listen. And he said, the Tibetans are burning, but they can't even show their smoke. He wasn't in particular relation to the body immolations. He was just saying that. And he said, therefore, it's up to the free people who are not under the Chinese to show what's really happening in Tibet, the death of my culture, my people. He said. So that then cheered me up a lot. And then I took a whole bunch of copies to the government exile people and to the private office and to him, and was nervous for the one night after I gave them all. And then there was like 20 people saying, "Can I have a copy? We want a copy." And they were all really good job. Oh, great, And then the next day, His Holiness posed with me. I have a picture posed with me holding the book like this. So I'm not worried about him being like that.
And Nana saw him on the live stream before the day 2 preliminary teachings, flipping through it. Like, he obviously seemed to be enjoying seeing, it's kind of cool to see your life in pictures.
So that's mainly the book. We should now sign books.